Welcome everybody to tonight's event. We're ready to get started. Dear Secretary Perez, dear Professor Kayser, dear Ms. Althaus, dear students, friends, guests, we are delighted to welcome you here for this discussion at the Hertie School. We're very proud to have you all with us this evening to take a look across the pond and discuss the current state of US politics and what it means for Europe. In times of crisis and ever-growing challenges, transatlantic cooperation is not only a matter of stability, but also one of necessity. We live in a moment where there are many issues that connect the US and Europe, and many of them are, of course, related to external relations, be it the brutal war Russia is waging in Ukraine, fighting the climate crisis, or maintaining energy security. Europe and the US must join forces and speak with one voice. Now, this, of course, is already a necessity, but we realize that it becomes ever more difficult if we at the same time have to think about protecting democracy and maintaining trust in government. And it is true that we all look to the US to know more about the challenges to democracy, and we are very worried and concerned by what we have seen unfolding in recent years. And so it's a true privilege to have you give us perspective on what we're observing with some fear, to be development of democratic institutions that we realize are not as stable as we might have imagined them in the past to be. And so understanding the trends behind polarization to us is really a necessity. And here at the Hertie School goes right to our heart, because one of the founding values at the Hertie School is to promote democracy. So understanding the inner workings of democracy really is truly at the heart of our mission. While we should never take democracy for granted, it is keeping me hopeful that we have people like Secretary Perez who dedicate their time, resources, and talents to public service and to making sure democratic institutions are filled with life and our values and ideals. I think you, Mr. Secretary, are a great example for our future leaders and change makers here at the Hertie School and beyond. You've not only fought for civil rights at the Department of Justice, trained young people as a professor, and fought for workers as a secretary at the state and federal level. You also served as a local politician in Montgomery County, Maryland, and worked for stabilizing the Democratic Party in truly challenging times. Your biography shows on how many different levels of policymaking one can make a difference. And it also hints at the complexity of what it takes to meaningfully engage in the democratic process. I'm sure many of our students will see that as an inspiration. And with all your experience and diversity in perspectives, you are the perfect guest to have with us tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I also want to warmly welcome Judith Althaus of the German Federal Chancellery, whom I thank for her willingness to moderate this event. She's an advisor for international politics to Minister of the Federal Chancellery Wolfgang Schmidt. After having served domestically at the German Federal Ministry of Families, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth, and internationally on posts in Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I also want to thank my dear colleague, Professor Kayser, Professor of Applied Methods and Comparative Politics here at the Hertie School, for joining us. His research interests are all rooted at the intersection of the economy, democracy, electoral behavior, and he spent a great deal thinking about political accountability. Before joining Hertie, he served as he was an assistant professor at the University of Rochester and has held fellowships at Nuffield College in Oxford and at the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford University. This is as much as I would like to give to you as an introduction. We're very pleased to have all of you with us today, and I'd like to have you on stage now, Mr. Secretary, for some remarks that we will then put to the test of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Madam President. Thank you for your very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here at the Hertie School. And I want to, number one, ask you one favor, which is it's a lot quicker to call me Tom, okay? We'll get through this a lot faster. It is an honor, really, to be here. This is not my first trip to Germany. I had the privilege of coming here a number of times when I worked in the Obama administration. And I came here because I always felt like I learned so much from the social compact that you have built, the relationships between workers and management through your co-determination and your works councils, things that frankly you do far better than we do in the United States. And I was particularly worried, Madam President, when you said we need to turn to the United States because you know, the most important dependent clause in our U.S. Constitution is the first dependent clause. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. From our founding, the United States has been an imperfect union. The original sin of slavery being one of many notable examples of our imperfection. But the journey to form a more perfect union has remarkable moments, one of which took place in June of 2008, right here in Berlin, when then candidate Obama spoke in front of something like 200 to 250,000 people. I was working on the Obama campaign at that time, and it was a remarkable moment. And I recall that night of the first Tuesday in November like it was yesterday, because we really thought, I kept thinking about that, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Our union got a little more perfect that evening, at least in my opinion, in the opinion of so many, not only around the country, but around the world. But we also know, and I'm not going to teach science tonight, but there is one rule of physics that seems to be in play here, which is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And as we look around in history, and if this meeting were taking place in October of 2016, I would have come to you with great confidence, and I would have said the following. Someone would have asked me about Brexit, and I would have said, yes, I understand what happened in the UK, but the global winds of nativism will never make their way to the shores of the United States. That's what I would have said. And I, in fact, did say that. And boy, was I wrong. And I had a high degree of confidence that we would again make history in November of 2016. And boy, was I wrong again. This is a humbling job, trying to predict politics and trying to live our most imperfect union. And let's face it, our democracy is on fire right now. And it's not our democracy in the United States. It's our democracy around the world. I was just in Taiwan. It's a remarkable democracy. The only female head of state in Asia. The only country in the region that has legalized same-sex marriage. Remarkable civil society. They're preparing for a potential invasion from China. That's what they're doing right now. Really serious stuff going on there. And so our democracies here and around the world, they're under attack. And we see it time and time again. And that's why the work you're doing right now, I think, is more important than ever. Because while I come to you with sobriety, born out of the fact that our democracies around the world are under attack, and they are on fire, and it's a five-alarm blaze, I come to you with an unrelenting optimism, because this is not the first time in our global journey to form more perfect unions, plural, that we've confronted this. In the United States, if you look at the mid-19th century, there was a movement called the Know Nothing movement, a fundamentally anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-anything that didn't look like one certain type of white person movement. Didn't go away overnight. Had supermajorities in states like Massachusetts. Massachusetts, you think about, oh, well, that's Ted Kennedy. I used to work for Ted Kennedy. I love Ted Kennedy. That was not Ted Kennedy's Massachusetts during the Know Nothing movement. We had the McCarthy era in the United States. And, you know, the day Joe McCarthy got censured in the United States Senate, McCarthyism didn't fizzle the day after. It fizzled when we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, came together. You know, Dr. King often said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it never bends on its own. You know, after we lost the 2016 election, President Obama asked me if I'd consider working and running for the chair of the Democratic Party. And I got some loyalty to the guy. And I did run, and I had the privilege of serving. And our job was to restore trust in the Democratic Party, to win elections. And we won our fair share of elections, culminating in 2020. And the way we win elections is we talk to people, we engage people, we include people, we hear them out, we fight for their values. And as I look at the landscape right now, I come to you with optimism because, again, our democracy continues to be on fire and it's a five-alarm blaze, but I do see evidence. And one person who was incredibly honest during the campaign cycle that just was completed in the United States was a guy named Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader of the United States Senate. He said during the campaign, candidate quality matters. There's a profound concept. Candidate quality matters. We want people who are up to the task, who have the relevant experience, who have a value set that is consistent with what we're fighting for. And when I look at especially what happened, during the last 4 years, I was very proud of what we were able to accomplish. In 2018, we flipped more governor's residences than any year since 1982. Governors are really important in the United States. Really important jobs. We flipped the House in 2018, and we flipped the Senate in 2020, and we won for Joe Biden in 2020. And we built an organizing infrastructure that enabled us to continue that momentum into 2022. Now, those of you who've studied U.S. politics, you will know that when you have a new president coming in, that first midterm election is usually, to quote a president I work for, it's usually a shellacking. That's certainly what happened in 2010. I can tell you, the president's political director, a guy named David Seamus, said to me in the run-up, Tom, this is a slow-moving train that we can't get out of the way of. That was in September of 2010. We knew that we were going to get run over, and boy, did we get run over in 2010. That's what usually happens. Well, why didn't it happen this time? This was historic. And I think it didn't happen for a number of reasons. The Roe versus Wade decision, a precedent that's been in place for 49 years, was taken away by a Supreme Court that is thoroughly out of the mainstream of American thought. And we are now one of a handful of nations around the world, a handful of democracies around the world that doesn't safeguard a woman's right to control her own body. We are on the wrong side. And you know what? That decision had immediate consequences in primaries leading up to November. Kansas, I don't know if any of y'all have ever been to Kansas or watched The Wizard of Oz. Kansas elected a Democratic governor in 2018 and re-elected a Democratic governor in 2022. What's the matter with Kansas, people ask? Not a darn thing. They're electing Democrats. And there was a referendum in Kansas on abortion rights, passing overwhelming margins. And if you looked at the precinct data, which nerds like me do, in the most red of red counties in Kansas, passing overwhelmingly. The Roe versus Wade decision awakened people to the extremism. And you watch in the November run-up, all these Republican candidates for Senate scrubbing their website of any reference to opposition to Roe, to a woman's right to choose. They were trying to, sweep it under the rug. That's what they were trying to do. Now, there were 6 referenda on the ballot in 2022, November. safeguarding a woman's right to choose. How many of those won? 6 out of 6 won. That's not the only reason, though. I think if you look at the data across the country in the United States, there were a host of races that were close, including last night's race, Raphael Warnock. And what you will see in race after race after race is there's a small but electorally relevant group of independent voters. These are folks who are not hardcore Democrats like me. They're not hardcore far-right Republicans, like MAGA Republicans, as they call them. They're folks who voted for Democrats, they voted for Republicans. In Georgia, many voted for Brian Kemp over Stacey Abrams, and they voted for Raphael Warnock over Herschel Walker, who parenthetically might have been the worst Senate candidate I've ever seen in my life. Just ask the lieutenant governor of Georgia, who refused to vote for him. Not making that up. And so, when you look at this, and you see independent voters, and if you go back race after race after race, in 2010 when we got shellacked among independent voters. In 2016 when Trump won, he did very well with independent voters. He has lost independent voters. And in fact, Trumpism isn't wearing well in America. There were 7 Senate races in which he actively supported candidates. 6 of the 7 candidates lost, Ohio being the only exception. There were 36 or so seats that were up for grabs seats in the U.S. House, 5 of which Trump actively engaged on behalf of the Republican candidate. He went 0 for 5 in those races. That's because voters understand the implications of January 6th. Not all voters. I mean, it pains me that 48.5% of Georgia voters voted for Herschel Walker. I'm going to just put that aside. But it does pain me. But the reality is, folks, we don't turn around these things overnight. And that's why I said, the McCarthyism didn't end overnight after the vote to censure him. The Know Nothing movement wasn't an on-off switch. And nor are these threats to democracy, whether they're here in Germany with the arrest today of people being charged in a plot similar to the insurrection on January 6th, or whether it's threats to democracy around the world. And we have to remember what Dr. King said, which is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. But the thing to remember is it never, ever bends on its own. And that's why I'm thrilled to be here with you. I've spent my entire career in public service. The 2 most important days of your life are the day you're born and the day you figure out why. And if you haven't figured this out, you had nothing to do with the former. And you have everything to do with the latter. And I encourage you to get involved. We were chatting just before this program tonight. We announced today that something like 18 million new enrollees in the Affordable Care Act, which is a remarkable accomplishment given that Republicans continue to try to kill it. And the reason I bring it up is when we first rolled out the Affordable Care Act, it was, in the words of Barack Obama, a debacle. It was a failure. The damn website didn't work. And it was an embarrassment to the president. But we learned from those mistakes. You're always going to make mistakes. Why do I bring up that example? Because, folks, implementation is a big part of what you do to succeed in government. I have loved every job I've ever had. That doesn't mean I've loved every day of every job, especially when I was chair of the party. A lot of friendly fire in that job. But you know what? It's all about making sure we are creating that more perfect union. And there's such a need right now for all of you to get engaged. Whether it's going to work in government, going to work for NGOs, going to work for comm shops in the 4th branch of government. Get involved. the core competencies that you're getting here are critical. I had the privilege of going to the Kennedy School, and I draw upon those lessons a lot. I took a course on leadership, and I remember what he told me and continues to tell me. I stay in touch with him 30 years later. Tom, remember, leadership is letting down your friends at a pace that they can absorb. I follow that a lot. I've tested that limit of leadership a lot. But I'll tell you, you don't get rich in this line of work, but the non-monetary rewards are indeed priceless. And right now, democracy is priceless. And democracy is under attack. But I would argue that democracy is not in decline. There's a distinction between the two. When I go to places like Taiwan and I see heroic work, yes, it's under attack, but you have so many folks willing to give their lives in some cases for the preservation or development of democracy. That's what we need to continue to do. And we need to share ideas. And we need to come together in a spirit of humility, because we have not been a good example for much of the last 5 or 6 years. But I'm proud of what Joe Biden has done to unify our coalition forces in the aftermath of Ukraine, working very closely with your chancellor and with others. That is our coalition of democratic leaders at their best. And we have more work to do. I firmly think that Joe Biden will run and will win a second term. And you know what? Yeah, he doesn't speak in iambic pentameter like Barack Obama did. But that's not what I look for in a president. I look for integrity. I look for accomplishment. I look for wisdom. I look for people who can bring folks together. This isn't, an oratory contest. This is a contest of who can lead the world, who can bring people together, who can address the most challenging problems. And what hasn't been reported enough, in part because we're lousy marketers of our own work, is that the first 2 years of this administration, we saw more accomplished than any 2-year period I've seen, perhaps since FDR. In the next 2 years for Joe Biden, we have to be all about implementation, and communication. Connecting things we're doing that are improving people's lives, making sure people know it. 40% of the American people were unaware of the fact that the $1,200 check they got from the federal government was because of the American Rescue Plan. They thought that just came. It was like the Publishers Clearinghouse, and they won $1,200. We've got to educate folks about that. That's the work that lies ahead. Again, I've had some bad days on the job, but my bad days have been outnumbered 100 to 1 by the privileges of helping folks who are living in the shadows. And so I hope you'll do the same. And I look forward to our discussion. And Madam President, thank you for allowing me to be here. This is a really important school, and you're studying at a really, really consequential moment in our global community's search to form that more perfect union. So thanks so much for having me. I look forward to the questions.
This is already on. Oh, very good. Thank you, Tom. You motivated me there. I hope that's true for everyone else as well. So you mentioned a couple of visits to Germany, and I don't know if you ever experienced a shift in public opinion or in the way that you were welcomed, but I would certainly say that at the moment we have a very good transatlantic relationship, that people are, there are very close ties between the governments, certainly, but there's also generally, I think, a very positive outlook towards the United States and possibly also to Europe from your country. And the other day, a German diplomat said to me that he believed that Joe Biden and Chancellor Scholz were the last transatlantic romanticists. How do you feel about that? I mean, meaning that Biden grew up politically in a time when ties were very strong to Europe still.
He believes it to his core. And, sometimes I think about where would we be if Donald Trump were still president and the Ukrainian invasion had occurred? Like I stopped thinking about that because it makes me shudder with fear. And Joe Biden, yeah, he grew up in the Depression era. He grew up in the birth of the United Nations. He grew up understanding that we are at our best when we are working together. Now, we're not always going to agree on everything. I just had Thanksgiving dinner. I don't agree on everything with my family, but we come together, and the common values that we share are so important. We understand, for instance, as a country, that Article 5 means something. You understood post 9/11 that Article 5 meant something to you, and we won't forget that. We understand that we have challenges as a global community. These threats to democracy, whether it's disinformation, whether it's all of the attacks on democratic institutions, this is not a limited virus right now. It's a global virus, and we have to tackle it together. And so I guess my friendly amendment to your observation is that the good news is that the two of them are absolutely in accord. And the good news is that they're not alone. Because I think our global community has come together remarkably in the aftermath of Ukraine. And we will continue to do that. I'm certain of that. And that's why, Joe Biden is one of the most underrated politicians I've seen. Again, because he doesn't, he has flubs once in a while. So do I. So does everyone. But, when it's crunch time, I'm telling you, as someone who worked really closely with him, his values are spot on. He's the most pro-union president we've had in the United States since FDR. And, he doesn't need talking points when we're going to meet with the union. That's a waste of time because it's in his DNA. And I think those qualities serve him well. And I think those qualities are one reason why we did unexpectedly well in the 2022 cycle, because elections are choices. Is he perfect? No. And he'll be the first to admit it. But boy, he's a hell of a lot better by, factors of infinity than the folks that they're putting up.
Well, I would say the same about our chancellor, but I'm sure I would get a lot more opposition from this room. So I'm just gonna continue and ask you, how sustainable would you say is the transatlantic bond?
I think we shouldn't take it for granted what we're seeing now with the unanimity and the solidarity you see among European countries in supporting Ukraine. I think much credit of that actually goes to the United States, in which you saw many things you never saw before. It was the first time that intelligence agencies, the United States, but also Great Britain, actually ahead of time, before every single move that was coming out of Russia, they would broadcast what was happening, what they expected, and then they were right repeatedly, and that built up a lot of credibility. That also helped actually pull lots of countries together into this union. There were many countries, and I think the Russians probably expected, that it would be tough to get all of Europe to rally as they did together. But I think a lot of credit really goes to the Biden administration. I don't want to, I'm trying to take the nonpartisan role here. I think that's probably going to end up being my role, but I think credit is due where credit is due for a real leadership role, and also making it very difficult for the Russians to peel people away from, our countries away from this coalition.
By the way, if you haven't read the article in Foreign Affairs from your chancellor, I commend it to you. I thought it was brilliant, and it really summarized kind of your question and your proposition, and put forth a really coherent vision of how we come together and what we need to do as a global community.
So the title of the discussion today is The Future of US Politics and Its Repercussions for Europe. You already, I think, ahead of the meeting, or just on stage, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act that is going to invest $369 billion in basically a green economy. I'm sure that you've heard that there is a lot of concern in Germany and in Europe, and I mean, obviously, President Macron was there to voice that concern, in that which we share. But I want to ask you, why is the IRA still good news?
Well, first of all, you know, you mentioned President Macron and the concerns that not just that France has, but other European countries have, you know, were obviously brought to the fore, and that's, again, I think the mark of a mature relationship is having conversations about things that give you heartburn and being able to work through them. The Inflation Reduction Act is a really important investment in climate change for the United States. It's also a really important investment to stem a phenomenon that is literally decades in the making, which is that you know, we used to make, I grew up in Western New York. We grew up 60 miles from each other in Western New York. And if you go another 60 or so miles east, there were large plants that manufactured computer chips in New York, and that hasn't been going on in forever. And we saw one of the things we learned from this, all the supply disruptions that grew out of the pandemic, is that we are at the mercy of you know, companies from around the world and countries, some of whom may not be friendly to our interests. And so we have to do a better job of insourcing. And that's a big part of what the Inflation Reduction Act is. Now, any legislation that you pass has intended consequences and unintended consequences. And I think you're going to see conversations with our allies about some unintended consequences that give people understandable heartburn. And I'm not here to speak for the administration, but I can speak for what I know about Joe Biden. Whenever there's a challenge to be confronted, he's not going to sweep it under the rug, because our relationships are too important to do that. But at the same time, we have to build more internal production capacity in the United States. And I think we can thread these needles. And I know that the administration is committed to engaging that discussion in meaningful ways. Secretary of State, I have heard, you know, numerous statements to that effect. I suspect it won't be easy, but it's a critical conversation that we're not going to, you know, shy away from.
Do you want to add to that? After?
Sure, I would. I would maybe just start at the beginning that the single biggest effect of the IRA is really going to be for the environment, right? And so if we're talking about the net effects of this, you know, everyone benefits from the United States reducing its global CO2 and other pollutant outputs. So that's very important. In many ways, I would say, yes, this is an unintended consequence. The United States was looking more at kind of local politics and wasn't thinking broadly or about Europe at the time it made this. But there is a certain amount of contrition, right, in the conversation with Macron, and I looked at it a little bit more closely, not much, but I realized, in fact, there's probably two concerns, right, that the Europeans have. One of which is simply that the subsidies offered under the IRA in the United States is a big incentive for Europeans to start producing in the United States, which could cause deindustrialization in Europe, right? Germany is very nervous right now. What's happening in Ludwigshafen, across the river from Mannheim, in which BASF, which is a massive factory, right, is actually now building a similar factory in China. And now they would have incentives also maybe to start producing in the United States, or other German or European conglomerates might do something very similar. And so that's one big concern. And the other concern is just for German companies that they can't compete, right? Because there's the domestic production requirement inside of the IRA. And so that would you know, preclude a lot of goods from, you know, European manufacturers. These things could be overcome. Right, there's the initial attempt, right, was to include, together with Mexico and Canada, the EU, right, as kind of a trade partner inside the IRA. It's too late, the law is passed, so that can't happen. But there's lots of exemptions. And the administration, in terms of implementation, like was a theme that we're talking about earlier, could implement the law in a way in that a lot of exemptions could be offered to European companies. And then also it's not a blanket coverage. A lot of these things were added by Congress, right? And so it's for specific goods where they have local content requirements. And for example, for electric delivery vans, it doesn't pertain, right? So you could ship German electric delivery vans, right, or with environmental kind of electric engines. That would be fine. And so it's limited in its effect. I haven't seen a very good analysis of what the effect would be, but it is a little bit scattershot, and there are loopholes that could be used if there's goodwill on both sides.
And I think goodwill might actually be one of the key words, coming back to the sustainability of the transatlantic relationship. I mean, we're looking at a very good relationship at the moment, and then where is this headed? So I think Germans would be nervous about looking at exemptions and then being afraid of where is this going to go in 2 years' time. But you, Tom, were very optimistic earlier in your statement about where we're headed in 2 years' time.
Well, I've learned not to be irrationally exuberant because I said to you I had a very high confidence interval in 2016. But I do think that I am optimistic because now we have 2 more years to implement and demonstrate that we've made progress. And that quintessential question that people get asked when an incumbent president's running for re-election is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that's the question that we have answers for that are absolutely in the affirmative. We've accomplished things such as probably a 20-year effort to give Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices. If you are the VA hospital, which is a huge medical operation in the United States, they have the power currently to negotiate, to use their scale to negotiate lower prices for drugs. But Medicare doesn't. Now, if you're wondering, how can that be? Here's the answer. Lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry have succeeded for for decades in preventing that from happening. We finally broke that logjam thanks to Democrats. And we've got to tell that story. And we got to connect the lower prices for insulin for people to something that we did, which is correct. It was something that we did. So, having said all of that, there are so many things now that weren't taking place 2 years ago. And so there's a lifetime between now and the presidential election. But, I feel like there is some momentum. And the one thing that I would take to the bank is Kevin McCarthy, who's the likely Speaker of the House. I don't say, I use the word likely because they're still having a circular firing squad on their side. And there are so many hard right Trumpers in the U.S. House of Representatives relative to moderate Republicans. I need one hand probably, and maybe my other thumb, to count the number of moderate Republicans. Most of them got wiped out or retired because they voted to impeach. And so the challenge he's going to have is that all these folks on the right want to do is they want to indict Hunter Biden, impeach Ali Mayorkas, and do all these things that are not the focus of the American people. So, it's going to be very interesting to watch. And Donald Trump's track record speaks for itself. I mean, he was our secret weapon on a certain level in 2022. And I feel I've thought about sending him a thank you note.
You said earlier to me that Trump was the gift that kept on giving. I very much enjoyed that.
Maybe an extension of that is, since we have Tom sitting here with us, do you think that Democrats are playing with fire in the primaries when they support Trumpist Republican candidates, thinking that they'll be easier to beat in the general election? That paid off, I think, in this election. I'm worried about the lesson, however, that's been learned by the Democratic Party. And if this were to backfire, it could be a complete disaster.
Well, it's not the ideal way to run an election. but it is an effective way. And there's a corollary question that often gets asked in tandem. You know, and I live in Maryland, a state that was one of 2 states that went all the way to the Supreme Court on the issue of gerrymandering. And I was hoping we were going to lose. By the way, we have 8 congressional seats in Maryland. And the complaint of Democrats in the redistricting process was they couldn't find a way to get to 8-0. If there had been a way, they would have done it. And I was hoping we were going to lose the case because I think gerrymandering and dark money have brought our democracy to its knees. But we didn't. The Supreme Court gave a green light to gerrymandering. And so I'm often asked the question, well, why don't you go to Maryland and make Maryland an example and use a commission and show that this is the moral high ground? And my answer to that, and it's sort of the same answer to your other question, is I don't go to knife fights with a spoon. And I don't believe in unilateral disarmament. We would have the United States House right now, majority, but for the fact that Ron DeSantis was very effective in gerrymandering Florida. And the Republicans in Wisconsin were very effective in gerrymandering their state. And the New York State highest court threw out the map. And we ended up losing 3 or 4 seats there. That's game, set, and match there. So I share your angst, but, you know, this is not new, by the way. You know, Claire McCaskill, some of you may know her, former senator, in 2010, she got another 6 years because there were 3 Republicans vying to oppose her, and she invested some of her own money in making sure that the most extreme guy won. And then she won the general election. So do I have unease about it? Yes. Am I going to advocate what I would call, you know, either unilateral disarmament or going to knife fights with spoons? Probably not. Is there danger? Are we playing with fire? Yes, potentially.
Would maybe an equivalent response, rather than, say, supporting extremists when they're really extreme and there's a chance, you know, if there were a wave election, then some of these MAGA candidates might actually win, and it would be a miscalculation on the part of the Democrats. Maybe in kind of a more appropriate response would be actually in gerrymandering. I think of New York State, right? And New York State kind of failed in their intention to gerrymander. And we saw what happened in the Hudson Valley in the last election. Mm-hmm. What happened there, and is there democratic culpability for that? I'm just using the opportunity here to get the really inside story.
Well, I mean, what happened in Wisconsin is they gerrymandered the bejesus out of it, and they control the Supreme Court, and so the Supreme Court upheld it. What happened in New York is they gerrymandered the bejesus out of it, and they thought a democratically controlled Supreme Court would also sanction it, given what the Supreme Court just did. And the democratically controlled Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And much to the surprise of Democrats who had gerrymandered the bejesus out of, I don't know what bejesus means, but I use it a lot. It's better than heck. And so that was, you know, that's really the story, is we thought that the court would do what other courts have done. And that explains kind of what happened there. And then, you know, Kathy Hochul was a first-time gubernatorial candidate. And, you know, when you're running for the first time, especially from upstate New York, you know, there's a lot of people that don't know you. And so she didn't win by the margins that others have won by. And that ended up, you know, hurting some of those congressional seats.
Maybe I can just jump in and ask you a little bit about the state of the Democratic Party, because you were DNC chair for a couple of years, and you probably have a very inside view of what is going on, how the party is getting ready for alliance building for 2024. So maybe you can give us a few insights.
Well, one of the things we always do, and this is what I did when I was there, in 2017, you take a look, you know, what went wrong. When I got to the DNC, you know, there was nowhere to go but up. We knew that what we had to walk and chew gum, and here's the walking part and here's the chewing gum part. The walking part was we had to reestablish our success in 3 critical industrial states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And in the 2018 election, we won all the statewide elections in those 3 states. And our goal for 2020 was to replicate that, because you do that and you hold serve everywhere else, it's game, set, and match. But that's not the only thing you should do. You also want to take a look at where are expansion opportunities. And if you look at, and I didn't need an analytics PhD to figure out that if you look at the trend data in Arizona and Georgia, and I actually have the trend data, in Georgia in 2012, Mitt Romney won by 8. In 2016, Trump won by 5, and we know what happened in 2020. In Arizona, Romney by 9, Trump by 3.5. So we saw where things were going, and we made early investments in those states. Now, you might be asking, well, what's the next frontier? I think the Democratic candidate for president in 2028 is going to win Texas. Why do I say that? Barack Obama lost by 16 points in 2012. Hillary lost by 9 points in 2016. Joe Biden lost by 5 points in 2020. Why do they make it really hard for black and brown people to vote? Because they're looking at this same data. They see what's going on. I'm not prepared to come here and tell you that the Democratic candidate for president is going to win in 2024, but I am prepared to put a little money on 2028. As long as this doesn't happen organically. This happens when you're organizing. This happens when you don't pick up your marbles and go home when you don't have victories right now. The seeds of success in Georgia, the person who deserves the major assist for Raphael Warnock's success is a woman named Stacey Abrams. Beto has lost a number of times now, but Beto is someone, when we win Texas in 2028, he should get, and in hockey you got primary assist, secondary assist. He should get a primary assist because he went to all the counties across the state. I think there's 256 or something like that. And he was doing that work. So this is what I'm sure my former colleagues are doing at the DNC right now. I mean, it was all hands on deck in Georgia. But there's some real opportunity in these seats. 6 years ago, in Georgia and Arizona, I'll leave you with this, there were 4 senators, obviously, 2 in each state, and all 4 were Republicans. We now have 4 senators, all Democrats. And we have 51 United States senators. And by the way, a state I left out that is a state that's ripe for Democrats is North Carolina. Got to do a lot more there. And the numbers are, we can do North Carolina as soon as 2024.
So you mentioned 2028, and then just out of curiosity, who would the Democratic candidate be? I don't need a name. I don't need a name. I just need, like, are we ready for whatever's out there?
Well, we continue to make history. We made history with President Obama. I thought we were going to make history with Secretary Clinton. We made history with Kamala Harris. We will make history, I think. I think the next president will be a woman and possibly a woman of color.
Right, 2028, a couple of more years to wait.
Yes.
But so we want to open up the floor for questions in a little bit, but I do have one last topic I want to cover, and that's a little bit of foreign policy with Ukraine and China mixed in there. And so the other day I was speaking with a colleague about just the way transatlantic relations were going, and he was saying, well, there are things that Trump was right about. And I realized I felt really awkward about that sentence and really wrong about that sentence, but he continued, and he did have some fair points. So is there something that you think Trump was right about?
I was waiting for you to tell me what your friend said.
They were easy ones. It's not that exciting. He said he was right about Nord Stream 2. Duh. I mean, a lot of people were right about Nord Stream 2.
Trump is correct that a lot of people have fear. You know, and the major source of fear that people have is that they're going to be, their kids' generation is supposed to be better off than them, and they're going to be worse off. And the thing about it, and I agree that we have, that's been the social covenant across the world, is your kids do better than you do. And that's what we should be striving for. And for a lot of folks in the United States, especially non-college educated folks, you know, as we move to a clean energy economy, if you're in Ohio and you close the coal-fired power plant and you're making $28, $30 an hour fully loaded in that job, and you're told, well, hey, they're going to manufacture solar panels, you go there and, you know, you can make 14, 15 bucks an hour. I wouldn't do that. That's not a just transition. And so this is the challenge. But what is so unconscionable is that his answer is to, well, it's not your fault, it was the immigrants' fault. And by the way, you know, I'm going to be your friend. And, you know, if you're someone's friend, why would you vote? Why would you try to get rid of Obamacare? If you're a friend of women, why are you, I mean, by the way, the Dobbs decision is not going to age well. It already isn't. Why do I say that? Example after example. Go Google the name Todd Rokita, if you have a chance afterward. Rokita, the Attorney General of Indiana. He's doing a case involving, I forgot how old the young girl is. I used the word girl deliberately in this. I think she was 12. And she had to go to Ohio. And now he's trying to sue her. That decision's not going to age well. So, yes, Donald Trump is right that people have concern. But, you know, I like Barack Obama because he summoned our best hopes. He understood that this is not about you can only succeed, Michael, if you fail. That's zero-sum politics. Or you can only succeed if the immigrant fails. That's unconscionable. That's un-American. That's wrong. And that is what angers me so much. And again, I'm just so, the number one reason I'm so happy to have Joe Biden is because we didn't know there was going to be a war in Ukraine. And I can't think of a person better prepared to help lead the coalition. And Germany, I am so appreciative and inspired by the over 1 million refugees that you have welcomed on top of Syria and other areas. And I applaud your current chancellor, and I applaud your former chancellor for doing that. That's a big deal. And you're doing far more exponentially than the United States is doing in that regard.
And winter's coming, so especially that refugee question might return sooner than later. The other thing that my colleague said Trump was right about was our defense spending. You know that Germany has historically not met its obligation of spending 2% on defense, and I don't think I'm telling you secrets if I say that I think it's, again, not happening this year. But it's something, I think the Ukraine war has shown us that this is something that we need to take seriously. And traditionally, I would say that especially left-wing Germans would have looked at our armed forces and found it somewhat amusing, even that it's not up to speed. And, you know, it was a bit of a laughing stock, but in an almost positive sense. And so this is a lesson learned. And do you think that the support for Ukraine in the US is going to continue?
I do. I mean, the two lessons we're discussing here, or one and then the other we should discuss, is we have national security preparedness, and we also need to have better pandemic preparedness. We weren't ready as a global community to tackle this pandemic. And, you know, this war in Ukraine is teaching us that we all have to come together. And I think we are. And so I'm optimistic moving forward. And I think the support will be there with one notable caveat, which is a lot of these far right folks that have sufficient numbers to make Kevin McCarthy's life difficult. You know, these are folks who are isolationists. And so you're going to see more from, I think, the Republican-controlled House to address this issue that is the subject of your question. And I feel like I know where Joe Biden is on that. And I know where, you know, the overwhelming majority of Democrats are on that. But it's just the world is so turned upside down. If Ronald Reagan were around, he would be shaking his head. I mean, the most prolific user of executive authority to help immigrants in the last 50 years in the United States was not Barack Obama in DACA. It was Ronald Reagan in 1986, after the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, the so-called amnesty bill. He didn't think amnesty was enough, and he went significantly farther through executive action. That aspect of the Republican Party is dead, and upholding Article 5, George Herbert Walker Bush understood what Article 5 meant. And this president, Trump, and you know the other, some of these Republicans in the House, you know, they don't seem to understand that. So I can't speak for them, and I will not be surprised if during the appropriation cycle that comes up.
And another big foreign policy issue would be China, and we already, two of us already touched up on that a little bit. But I think you saw some potential for conflict there in our transatlantic relations.
Yeah, maybe this actually connects to both of your questions, right? Going back to the previous one on what was Donald Trump right about? The Biden administration has actually continued with a policy of skepticism toward China. That's something that actually started in the previous administration. We see a lot of these things, right? We do see intergenerational income disparities that are the generation in the United States born in 1979. That cohort is the first, if you look at data from Rothschild, that will not have the same standard of living as their parents. This hasn't happened before, right? And part of these lessons are globalization was a huge hit. It brought a lot of wealth to the United States, but the allocation of the benefits from globalization were not shared very well. And that's kind of a legacy of what you see from multiple administrations going back over half a century, both Democratic and Republican, and possibly also one of the deeper sources for the politics that we see today. Vis-a-vis Germany's position in the United States, relationship now with China is, Germany might be stuck in the middle. It's not a very comfortable position, I think. You of course could say much more to this than I could, but maybe I'll prompt you to say something about this. And that the United States is very aware of German investments in China at the time that they are trying to isolate China and see China as a possible, not just trade rival, but as actually as a military threat in the future. Germany at the same time is very dependent on exports to China. Germany, over the last couple of decades, ran a huge surplus in trade to China, did a very good business with China. But at the same time that Germany is facing an energy crisis that is affecting its competitiveness, now the United States is leaning on Germany actually to, cut itself off from one of its primary export markets. And I guess there's a question of, is this too much to demand? But at the same time, there are good reasons for this. How does Germany proceed? What is the way out of this this position? I'm sorry, I'm turning the question around to you because I don't know the answer. That's why I'm asking you.
I was going to think, what would Olaf Scholz say? His recent visit to China, I think, sort of mapped out where we're headed. I think we're we're trying to be liberal but not stupid. This is something that he used to say when he was mayor of Hamburg. And we want to continue, we don't want to decouple, and I think even the US does not want to decouple, but we want to be, we want to be secure in the sense that no critical infrastructure should depend on China. And again, this is probably a lesson we learned the hard way very recently, but we're still looking at ways to continue business, but obviously not business as usual. But maybe there's opinions on that in the audience, who knows? So I'd like to open the floor for questions. And I don't know if we want to maybe collect a few questions. I'd also really invite the female members of the audience to ask questions.
First, thank you for coming and holding this conversation. I require a little background. I've been taking notes, but I'll be as brief as I can be. The United States has been lagging in several areas. I mean, you've mentioned the refugee crisis, for example, where Europe has been doing all it could, for example, for environment, to keep our consumption of fossil fuels down. The United States has been lagging in its control of the pharmaceutical industry. And these two things have one thing in common. You have a major logjam in your own Democratic Party in the person of Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And my question is, what is the Democratic Party going to do now that it has a little edge in the Senate to control the power of Joe Manchin, who has not been your friend? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he had some input in this, in the Inflation Reduction Act and altering it. And, you know, by way of background, Joe Manchin has personal interests, his family interests in the coal industry and in the pharmaceutical industry, and has been, you know, protecting those interests for a very long time from his positions of power in the US Senate that your party has given him. Is there going to be some change in this next, after this election?
You ready to answer right away, or you want to collect another question?
No. Oh, yeah. I mean, either way,
Whichever.
I can answer that.
Go ahead.
I'll just do it. If Joe Manchin doesn't get reelected, then a Republican will get elected in West Virginia. And I can tell you the Republican who will get elected. His name is Alex Mooney. Alex Mooney used to be a state senator in Maryland when I served in Maryland state government. He is very, very far to the right. And what happened, the reason he's now in West Virginia is he got run out of the state of Maryland because he lost his election so badly. He literally left the state and went to West Virginia, where he ran for Congress and won. And then West Virginia lost a seat in redistricting. And so he ran against another Republican and beat him. And now he's announced he's going to run against Joe Manchin. I think Donald Trump won West Virginia by 40 points. So Joe Manchin, I wish would do a few more things that he hasn't done. Joe Manchin, given the politics and the political makeup, politics is the art of the possible. We did get an Inflation Reduction Act, less than I wanted, less than others wanted, because we didn't have enough. We needed 52 Democrats, actually, to get what we needed, but we didn't. But we got a very muscular bill in the end of the day. And he flexed his muscle to help with that. I would again point out that we now have the power to negotiate in Medicare to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. It's not all of the drugs. There's only a certain number that are there, but we have the nose under the camel's tent. And once you get the nose under the camel's tent, it's Katie bar the door. So I feel very good about this. And again, you know, I used to get people would admonished me, why don't you do more about the governor of Louisiana who's a Democrat who's anti-abortion? It is correct that the governor of Louisiana is anti-abortion. So I guess what they were asking was I shouldn't support him, in which case we would have a remarkably far-right Republican who wouldn't expand Medicaid, like the current governor did, who wouldn't raise the minimum wage, like the current governor did, and wouldn't do a number of other things. And I live adjacent to West Virginia. I'm an hour from the West Virginia line, and I will tell you with certainty, if you don't want Joe Manchin there, then you should just be prepared for someone who is Ted Cruz-esque. And that's not something I think I'd want.
Tom and all, thank you so much for being here. I'm a student here, but from the US. And to your point of communication for Biden's strategy, especially in the next 2 years, something I've noticed living in Germany is how neutral the news seems compared to our options in the US. And I'm curious from your side, I mean, you talk about the importance of implementation and communicating what's happened, and that as a strategy to bring independents on board and to keep Democrats on board. I'm curious how viable you think that strategy is given the polarization of news sources in the US, both by people's choice of what to look for and algorithms that push that point to the extreme.
I mean, the polarization makes it hard. And so we've got to, I do some work for a super PAC. And one of the things we did in Georgia that we measured, and it was really successful, is we use micro-influencers, people in Georgia who have a following, a following of critical mass so that they can reach people. And I think that was that's proven to be a really effective tool. One of the things that creates perverse incentives is Donald Trump was a ratings bonanza for everybody in 2017. If you look at MSNBC's ratings, CNN's ratings, Fox's ratings, they all went through the roof. And that created an incentive to have every single episode, and I don't want to pick on one or the other, but it's like you have 4 shows, one after another. And, it's basically the 9 o'clock show. We're going to do exactly what happened at 8 o'clock. Everything has been said, but not by everyone. So I'm going to say it now. And then the guy at 10 o'clock and the woman at 11 o'clock does the same thing. And ratings were through the roof. And so there was an appetite for it. What I'd like to see, which I doubt I will, tucked into the American Rescue Plan was an $87 billion bailout of the multi-employer pension plan. Now that might put you to sleep, but you know what? For literally millions of retired, mostly union members who worked at places like UPS, they had a $4,000 pension, and because the pensions were underfunded, they ended up having to take a 30% haircut. So New York State just allocated $1 billion out of that fund to help literally tens of thousands of folks. And not only are they going to go from $2,700 back to $4,000, but they're going to get a check for all those months when they went down to $2,700, a lump sum check. And you know what? I bet you again, they're going to have no idea that not one Republican voted for that bill that gave them that check. And you know what? I haven't seen anything on MSNBC or CNN about it because it's not about Donald Trump. And so that's the challenge that we have. And we have to tell that story. And we've got to figure out unique channels to communicate because, that's not going to be, Rachel Maddow just did a show on the hiring of the district attorney's office in New York of a new person who used to be my chief of staff and is a very good friend. And I spoke to the New York Times reporter who was doing the story, and I'm thrilled that it was a nice story. And then she did a whole story on it. Why is it newsworthy for her? Because when he was at the New York AG's office, he investigated Trump. So it was a whole story about Trump. And the DA's office is beefing up so they can go after Trump. I texted her, hey, great story. I should have said, hey, I want to talk to you about the pensioners in New York who got a raise.
So But when you figure out communication, let us know.
Yeah. Haven't cracked that code.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about Maryland. First off, I'm sorry how the Democratic primary turned out. You had my support for what it's worth.
Where do you live?
In Columbia.
Oh, sure. We won Howard County.
Yeah. But you talked about, or traditionally Maryland has been pretty blue the past 20, 30 years. You talked about the guy who lost the race and went off to West Virginia, but yet you had the emergence of Dan Cox, for the governor's race. So is that, Democrats propping up this far-right candidate, or is maybe Maryland, for instance, not as blue as people thought it was?
So just to give context to others, so I ran for governor this cycle. We had the closest primary since 1966, and I came in a close second. And then what you do after you come in second is you actually come together. You don't ask, for a recount like they're doing in Arizona. And by the way, the people she's criticizing it's the Republican Party that ran the election, or Republicans who ran the election, but I digress. And by the way, Mark, yes, the Democratic Governors Association spent $4 million to ensure that this guy, Dan Cox, who's an insurrectionist, won the Democratic primary in Maryland. And that's because there was another person, her name is Kelly Schultz. If she had won the primary, then whoever was the nominee, whether it was myself or Wes, who ultimately was the nominee, that would have been a 1 or 2 point race, without a doubt. And they spent $4 million to save $10 million. That's what they would tell you. And it is what it is. Maryland is not a Trump state. Period. Hard stop. And I'm proud of that. And the election, the general election, ended on primary election night. And I like living in a state that's not a Trump state. But, we have to get back to, when I worked for Senator Kennedy, I did a ton of work with Senator Hatch's teams. Senator Kennedy was the liberal lion of the United States Senate, but he was also someone who got stuff done. And he had genuine relationships. They could put they could rise above the politics of the moment. We've lost that art. I mean, that is such a lost art now, and it's something we have to get back to.
What I would be interested in is what the Democratic Party's vision on education is for the United States. And the reason I'm asking that is because from a German, somewhat European point of view, I'd say we have a history of making education very accessible, right? It's quite, to compare it, it's quite cheap at the end of the day to get a decent education here. And in my mind, that's one of the fundamental problems that the US is facing, that access to education has been and is becoming increasingly harder. What's the vision going forward in terms of making education more accessible to everyone, really?
The vision needs to be that zip code never determines destiny, and that your ability to pay should never stand in the way of your ability to pursue whatever educational path you want, whether it's higher education, whether it's apprenticeship, whatever it ends up being. I said, and you'll notice I said the vision should be. The reality is zip code does determine destiny, and I led the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department and can show you school districts, to this day that are still separate and unequal. And race matters. And I live in one of the wealthiest states in the United States. It's first, second, third, something like that, Maryland. And I'm a proud public school parent. But we have disparities. And this is, and the difference between, I don't know enough about the German, K to 12 model. But, one of the challenges in the United States is that education, a linchpin of education is local control. And local control has advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. And unfortunately, school boards have become a flashpoint now in culture wars. I'm all for parental involvement. Absolutely. And we worked hard when I was in local government to facilitate parental involvement and input. I'm also all for facts. There's a town in Maryland called Taneytown. Taneytown is named after a guy named Roger Taney. Roger Taney is an author of one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in the 19th century, the Dred Scott decision. Now, I call teaching about Roger Taney the infamous history. Some people call that critical race theory. I call that teaching facts. And we're getting embroiled in, and a number of, there was a candidate for governor in Virginia who very effectively, used, these sorts of culture war issues and won an upset victory in that governor's race in 2021. I mean, we've got to come to, our economic competitiveness is dependent on building strong pre-K and childcare and building strong investments from, again, pre-K through career, because learning is lifelong. And we have a lot of work to do there as a country, and we're falling behind. You look at OECD data, and we're not at the top of the heap on so many measures of numeracy, literacy, numerosity, things like that. And so, and it does differ by states, and within states it differs among local jurisdictions. I don't see us moving away from a local control, and that's always the inherent tension in the United States is, how much is directed from the federal government versus how much, comes up from local government. And that's a tension that persists.
Could I extend that question a little bit to university education? Mm-hmm. The state of Maryland, like most U.S. states over the last decades, has cut funding to public universities to a point where, at UCLA, a school that I know very well, or University of Michigan, it's usually rough 10% of their budget actually comes from state funding. So even, top state universities in the United States are nearly private. And a lot of these costs that used to be paid by the government through subsidies are now picked up by the students. And that makes it much more difficult for students actually to work their way through college. It was possible in the 1980s, for example. But now that's just impossible with a student job and some loans to make your way through college, and people are coming out with massive debts. What's, on the state level, I'm not on federal policy, but on the state level, is there any chance that will change? And is there recognition that that's a problem?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my wife is the oldest of six, and they live in Wisconsin. She grew up in Wisconsin. There were three of them at University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is the flagship campus in Wisconsin. And her parents were paying a total of $1,600 a year for the three of them when they were in school. That's books and fees now in a lot of public universities. And, it's state by state. And there's a strong movement to, make community college free for those who can't afford it. There's been debates within the progressive community. Is it free for everyone? I don't think, like Donald Trump's kids, we should subsidize them. We don't have enough money to subsidize everyone. So, I was a Pell Grant kid. Pell Grants in the U.S., for those who aren't from there, when you're from a low-income household, you're eligible for federal money. And, that helped sustain me when I was in school. We've got to muster the political will to make this the rule and not the exception, because we have priced people out of the market for this. And, and that's, again, you asked a great question. And I gave the normative statement. I didn't say what is, but the normative statement is that your ability to pay should never affect your ability to get whatever education you want and not have a mortgage. And that's the bottom line. People have mortgages in the United States. My nephew is a doctor now. He has $270,000 in loans. And, you know, and the theory is you're a doctor, you're going to go and, you know, make money and this and that. And, you know, he's kind of a public interest doctor. He doesn't really want to make, you know, a huge amount of money, but he's sort of forced into that because $270,000, that's a chunk of change.
I think we have time for two more. I'd say two more. And maybe if it's a quick one, a third.
Yeah, there's three. So
I
saw
know.
three hands, and I'll be quick.
I'm a tough negotiator.
Yes.
Thank you. It's so great to have you here. So when you mentioned that metaphor about coming to a knife fight with a spoon, I was more thinking Republicans were showing up with a gun, and you might have been showing up with a knife. And especially thinking about the context of the Supreme Court and thinking there will be for 20, 30 years an ultra-conservative majority, does there come a point when pushing these democratic norms and principles beyond a line where the only strategic response from Democrats could be to also come with a norm-breaking, non-democratic strategy against that? For example, court packing. So do you think there's a line which could be crossed by Republicans when Democrats should also start like these foul strategies to respond to?
No, it's a great question. And, you know, my views have evolved on a number of the issues that were part of your question. You know, we're one of the only countries in the industrialized or we're one of the only democracies in the world where Supreme Court justices serve for life. That's the rare exception. And they stole 3 seats. You know, and I won't. We all know the details of that, and you know, I agree with your premise that we're too nice. You know, it took a long time for immigration reform because we had this naive theory back in 2009 that, you know, we're going to be tough on immigration for the first year, and that'll be our sign of good faith. And once they see that we're acting in good faith, then they'll do the same. Well, you know what they did? They banked everything we did, and they said, you guys are really stupid because we're not doing a damn thing. I want him to be a one-term president. Didn't you hear me? I really meant it. And that's why when you ask the question, do I feel uncomfortable? Yes. Would I do it differently? No. And I'm sad to hear myself say that. But, you know, we have to take off the gloves. We need to eliminate the filibuster. We need to make sure that there's a movement called the National Popular Vote movement, because we have to, you know, the Electoral College has worn out its welcome. And I mean, it used to be the rarest of occurrences that somebody won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College. And by the way, basically every Republican that wins the presidency in the next 20 years, that's what's going to happen because of our structure as it is. And so we've got to do things like that. And I'm all for term limits. I'm not for packing the court, but I think term limits would do the trick. I am all for getting rid of the filibuster. The filibuster has been used to thwart civil rights legislation and other things, and it shouldn't be done. And that's why we're one short to get a lot of this done, unfortunately, because if we had 52, we'd get it done. And I wish Joe Manchin would do that. I don't know that he's going to get, see the light on this. We'll certainly try.
So my question was going to be about institutional reforms, but I'll tweak it, given that you've just answered that already. So assuming that the lame duck session passes the Electoral Count Act, how confident are you that the results of the 2024 election will run in a manner that resembles something smooth and in a democracy?
I have a lot of confidence in that. And I really applaud the work that the commission has done. And I applaud Congresswoman Cheney, who's been a very courageous figure. And again, you know, the sad news, if you ever read the book Profiles in Courage, the one common denominator in that book is it could be retitled Profiles in Failure, because generally, like, they did a courageous thing, and they either lose their life or they lose their job, but it was the right thing to do. I want to start promoting profiles and courage that will do the right thing and actually, not get the head severed. There was one more in the back, sir. Okay, two more, yeah.
Cool, thank you. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm from Washington, D.C. So my question is about the filibuster, as you just mentioned. So there are a lot of things I would like to see the Democratic Party do that they cannot do because the filibuster exists. But I'm actually a fan of it simply because I want it to be there should the Republicans take power in 2024, as it was there from 2016 to 2020. How do you reconcile that? Do you just think it's a risk worth taking to get rid of it? Or do you think that if it's gone and the Democrats do what they want, no Republican in the party's current form gets elected again? Like, how do you reconcile that?
Well, I mean, the Republicans declared in 2016 that you should never hear we should not confirm a Supreme Court justice anytime near an election until 2020, when RBG dies, and then they changed the rule. So, and I have no doubt that if they were to take over and have all three branches of government, they'll do whatever it takes to do what they want to do. And the challenge that they need to reckon with is that they have become so extreme. That a big reason why we're winning these elections. We have a Democratic governor in Kansas, second time in a row. Sharice Davids in Kansas. They tried to put her out of business, failed. They are so extreme right now that, again, that cohort of independent voters, and again, Warnock won independent voters last night in Georgia by a double-digit margin. And so, I don't know if they'll ever have a reckoning, because there are very few electoral consequences in the House. Again, if you are a Democrat or a Republican, if you're a Democrat, your biggest fear when you cast a vote in the House, for most Democrats, is a challenge to your left. And if you're a Republican, your biggest fear is a challenge to your right. That is not a formula for encouraging the pursuit of common ground. And so, I'm not worried about, I'm no longer, I was worried. Your question is a good question. I used to be worried about that. I can no longer be worried about that, because we need to do this, and we need to do it now, and then it'll become part of the American consciousness. I hope they try to repeal the ACA again, because they just do us a favor every single time they try to do it. Yes.
It's really the very last. I'm sorry. The very, very last.
So my name is Federico and I come from Italy. And in Italy we have now a huge problem with demographics, and we're going to have a huge shortage of workers in the future probably. And so now politics is focusing more on increasing fertility, but at the same time it's a far-right government, so they want to stop immigration. So I was wondering, do you have the same problem in the US, or is it going to be a problem in the future? And what are the possible solutions? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we have our major challenge in the U.S. is we need to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and until we get rid of the filibuster, we're not going to be able to do it, because and then we've got to get the House back, which I think we can in 2024, and so that is. And by the way, the Congressional Budget Office scores every potential bill that's introduced, and if you want to grow the economy, when you look at the immigration bills, I mean, the fiscal notes on those, immigrants, how they contribute to the tax base. There's just so many ways in which having more immigrants is helping our vibrant economy. I was the labor secretary in Maryland, and we did a very comprehensive study on the contributions of immigrants in Maryland. A foreign-born Marylander is more likely to have a college degree than a native-born Marylander. If we didn't have foreign-born Marylanders in Maryland, we wouldn't have a healthcare profession. We wouldn't have a biotech profession. We wouldn't have hospitality. We wouldn't have so many professions. And you know, I am saddened by what I see happening in Italy. And you know, and I think I hope what will ultimately happen is they will have a short tenure, because if we want to, we have so many workforce challenges in the United States right now. And the solution I always raise my hand about is, how about immigration reform? Let's get folks out of the shadows.
So I'm really sorry, there's no more time for questions, but maybe you'll stick around for a glass of water. So maybe that might be your chance. So thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for filling us with optimism. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the next 2 years bring. And I really want to share your optimism about the next president and the second next president. So very much thank you for your time, and thank you for your time and your questions. And get home safely.